So if I go with the statistics provided by this report in the part 2 of the video, then in 1995, which precisely means near about 12 years from now, 12 years ago, no, 27 years ago, the global sovereign debt was 16.7 trillion, according to this report. So in 1995, which means 27 years ago, it was 16.7 trillion. And I'm sure that even at that point of time, we were having the so-called political leaders who stressed the fact that we might be able to contain that debt. But from 1995 to 2020, because the figures are as per 2020, which means around 25 years, the debt level is near about 4 times, which means 16.7 trillion to 62.5 trillions, which means in 25 years, debt level grew by 4 times. But in only 1 year, which is 2019 to 2020, debt level grew by 20%, which means 53.3 to 62.5. So the pace is accelerating at a much faster way than we are envisaging. Rather, I would say we failed to envisage that, which would be better. The very starking, I would say the data which is coming is that by end of 2020, central banks owned 24% of the global sovereign debt. 24% now, which means that 62.5 near about 16 trillion. In fact, it would be more than 16 trillion, but precisely you can say. Now, what the hell it is? Let me explain you this. So there were the times when the governments were raising the money directly from the public or the foreign investors. Now this time has changed, because in the last several years, academically speaking, the world faced artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all these things, but the income level, I repeat, the income level of the people fallen drastically. And population growth in the last several years almost halted, I would say, almost halted. Now, since the income level of the people halted, or I would say is growing at a very small pace as compared to you are envisaging, so the governments are not in a situation to raise a huge quantity of debt. So what governments now doing, and it is not that few countries, everyone, almost all governments are doing that. Almost all governments are doing that. So what the governments are now up to is they are asking the central banks to print the money, irrespective of the denting consequences of this, irrespective. And the central banks are forced to follow this instruction. and they are also printing the money. Since they are printing the money, this adds up to a concept called financial inflation, which we'll talk later. But this lying in the balance sheet of the central banks, just like Federal Reserve is near about 8.5 trillion of balance sheet. European Central Bank is also having an near about 8 trillion of balance sheet. People Bank of China is very near to 6 trillion of balance sheet, rather 7 trillion would be the precise figure. Bank of Japan, where the debt to GDP ratio is ballooning, I would say ballooning to 300%, which means if your GDP is $1, I would say your debt is $3. The Bank of Japan is also near to 8 trillion, you can say. So together, Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and People Bank of China, together, they contribute near about 31 trillion worth of debt. And majority of this debt in the last several years is because of the printing of the money. Rather, I would say excessive printing of the money. And this report by the Janus Henderson confirms this fact, which is that by end of 2020, central banks owned 24% of the global debt, up 5 percentage points, which means the government are more, I would say, the governments are more dependent on their central banks to print the money, which, by the way, is not a good signal. And why the hell it is not a good signal? Because sooner or later, now when I say sooner, I'm not saying that tomorrow, and when I'm saying later, I'm not saying after 100 years. Sooner or later means in a span of another 3 years of time, this has to bust. This has to bust tremendously. And this busting would collapse the whole system. In the later stages, we'll talk more about that. But the starking reality, which we need to cover in this part of the video, is that in 1995, which precisely 20 years ago, why I'm saying 25 years ago, because the data is as per 2020 by Janus Henderson. So if I go with 2020, in 1995, the global sovereign debt was 16.7 trillion, which in 2019 rose to 53.3 trillion. And by 2020, as per this report, it is about 62.5 trillion. Which is very near about 4 times of the 1995 figures. And out of this 62.5, near about 24%, which means 25, you can say 1/4, which is near about 16 trillion figure. 1/4 of this figure is contributed by the central banks, which means a heavy printing of the money. And printing of the money always ends up as a consequence which is known as financial inflation. We will talk about that in part 3. Welcome to part 3 of the video. In this, I would be highlighting a very important fact which is mentioned on page number 6 of the report. And that is a very starking fact which I got to know. And I was like, oops, how come this fact was not discussed in CNN, BBC, Bloomberg, and other channels? Because Bloomberg, I can guarantee, because I watch that almost 10 to 12 hours in a day. And I not been through this kind of statistics which is being provided by Janus Henderson in this page number and 6. I show you the chart also so that you can see what kind of data I am referring to. See this chart. Guys, do you know what this chart is talking? But before this chart, let me read a paragraph for you, which is very important paragraph. Even before the pandemic struck, the world governments ran deficit in every of last 25 years. So I told you 25 means from 1995 to 2020 because the statistics provided is of 2020. So even before the pandemic struck, the world governments ran deficit in every of the last 25 years. So all the Einsteins, Edisons, Newtons, those who are claiming that because of the corona, the world governments need to borrow a huge quantity of the money, and this ends up in a big deficit, then don't misguide us. And by the way, I'm saying this from the last several years that this is beyond convention, which corona is just an excuse. I would say corona is just an excuse as far as the central government's debt are concerned. So it's a mere excuse which is taken up by the governments. As spending ran ahead of tax collection, debt rose inexorably from 16.7 trillion in 1995 to 53.3 trillion in 2019. Thus, an increase of 4,371 US dollars to 11,187 per person. Now this, the index represent 67% of the global population. The world economy also grew substantially, underpinning the debt with the largest tax base, but the increase in sovereign debt has nevertheless means in spite, outstripped economic growth by fifth, which means if the economic growth is $1, assuming, then the debt is $5. And this point I'm raising many times I raised this point many times in the last several years, that the governments worldwide are raising a huge quantity of money. And not only the governments, rather selected countries corporates. Like as we speak on 16th March 2022, around 2 months ago, the world saw Evergrande and many such real estate companies of China. Many such real estate companies of China. Now, at a given point of time, Evergrande was having near about, I would say, 324 billion. You heard me very right. 324 billion worth of debt. Balance sheet. And see what happened. Today, if you look at Evergrande share price in Hong Kong, it's in cents. Cents. And Evergrande is not the only company. There are numerous companies we have in that regards. Numerous companies in that regards. But anyways, this is a live example that, things are beyond control now. But what happens that people hardly bother. Like, for example, the government's almost managed to balance the books during 2007 economic boom, just before global financial crisis, but within 2 years, which means 2008, 2009, they borrowed $1 out of every 15 they spent. As a result, the growing debt mountain was worth 70% of the global income by 2019. 70% of the global income is debt. %70%. And this figure is as of 2019. Unfortunately, the present statistics is not available, but it won't be conducive. You know that. And let's talk about this chart, which is a very healthy chart to discuss and much to deliberate. According to this chart, by 2025, which is estimated figure, the total debt of the globe, sovereign debt of the globe, might end up reaching 80 trillion. So today is the figure provided is 2020, which is 62 trillion, 62.5. Now by 2025, which means 5 years from these figures, it would be 80 trillion, which means a jump of not less than 18 trillion. 18 trillion. So 18 trillion worth of debt to be added in another 5 years. If I go with this report, because the statistics are provided as of 2020. This is not conducive figures. I don't think that, and I don't know why the big channels like CNN, BBC, Bloomberg, and many, they are outrightly rejecting these figures. I don't know why are they outrightly rejecting these figures, because once I see these figures, I was like, what the hell? Not the report, what the hell? Basically, where are we heading? Now in English, there is a line called directionless heading, which means that you are heading, but you do not know where are you heading. Now this is called directionless heading to me. Because by 2025, according to the estimate figures, which is 5 years from the statistics provided, you are reaching to 80 trillion of debt, which, by the way, is a huge number according to me. Probably not to you. See you in the part 4 and very stark realities.